Ahora va a intervenir en segundo lugar para hablarnos también del acuerdo de asociación el profesor Marc Maresceau. Marc Maresceau es catedrático ad personam Jean Monnet de Derecho Europeo de la Universidad de Gante y es profesor visitante del Colegio de Europa en Brujas y en Atolín. Es un académico de enorme prestigio, especializado en Unión Europea y más específicamente en lo que son las relaciones exteriores de la Unión Europea y la política de vecindad. Y tiene un interés, yo casi diría personal, en los pequeños estados. Me contaba que tiene la biblioteca, una de las bibliotecas más importantes que existen sobre pequeños estados. Además conoce Andorra y ha trabajado para Andorra desde hace muchos años. Él estuvo implicado directamente en la negociación del acuerdo de 1990, un acuerdo que se hizo antes de la Constitución, y después ha seguido asesorando a los diversos gobiernos en aspectos de la negociación y, como nos recordaba el ministro, es coautor de un libro que dibujaba ya a finales de la primera década de los 2000 el escenario que hoy estamos viendo que se está configurando, que es Andorra hacia el mercado interior. Agradeciéndole que se haya desplazado desde Gante. Marc Maresceau, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure, honor to be here this morning to try to present a general overview. That was what I have been asked. A general overview of the Andorra-EU relations with a particular focus on the objectives of the current negotiations. But we already had a number of very distinguished speakers. The minister took the floor and went already quite extensively in this topic. We had Mr. Martin already explaining the situation as it stands for the moment at the level of the negotiations. So it is for me somehow difficult, because many of the things which I had intended to mention have already been mentioned in one way or another by the previous speakers. But I will try to concentrate on some of the aspects, I think, which are relevant, interesting, perhaps, I hope, and which may try also to clarify certain aspects of this rather complex relationship between the European Union and Andorra. And of course, any overview of this relationship starts with this very important agreement of 1990 between Andorra and the European Community. It has already been mentioned at various occasions this morning. And the most fascinating, just one word perhaps about this agreement, it is the origin of this agreement, which is extremely fascinating. I cannot go into the various aspects of it, but perhaps just one point, which is the historical context in which this agreement was signed. You have to put it into the accession of Spain to the European Union, and it was explicitly provided in this agreement in an annex, and I will just quote one sentence of that annex, that an arrangement governing trade relations between the European Community and Andorra was to be finalized within a period of 2 years of the date of entry into force of the Act of Accession, Spanish accession to the European Community. And this arrangement had to replace the national arrangements which existed before the accession of Spain to the European Community. What is interesting, I think, to note, it has not been mentioned yet, that is that it was the European Community which took the initiative to start negotiations on the agreement of 1990. It was not Andorra as such, it was the European Community. And as a result of this, of the accession of Spain to the European Community. And it could not materialize the agreement in the 2 years which were foreseen in the annex, And this was not due because of the position of the European community, but it was the result of the very complex position of Andorra in international relations, which had to be clarified first. So this is the start of these negotiations, and in the end, the agreement as it was signed and concluded in 1990. I'm not going now to explain the contents of that agreement. I take for granted that most of you know it, but let me just maybe pick out one or two elements just to illustrate a bit the size and also, I think, the effect on the current negotiations. The first point, I think, which has to be highlighted is the fact that this agreement of 1990 established a customs union. You should know that a customs union is extremely rare in external relations by anybody in the world, and also by the European community and now European Union. For the moment, European Union, which has signed more than 1,000 agreements, bilateral and multilateral, there are only 3 customs unions. The first one today is with Andorra. Then we have the one with San Marino, which is partly copied from the Andorran agreement, if I may say that. And also the agreement with Turkey, the decision of the Turkey EU Association Council, which brought into force a customs union. So it is a very rare bird. And the customs union, as it was conceived in 1990, only covered industrial products, did not include agricultural products. So I think everybody should know that in order to understand also the negotiations which are going on and which were explained in particular by Mr. Martin and Minister Saboya already. Another point I think in that agreement which is very unique, and there are many points which are unique, but I limit myself to just 2, the one with on the customs union. The other one is on the special allowances, les franchises, which is very unique, I think, in this agreement. Not that franchises are exceptional in international trade relations between the EU and third countries, but the way how they have been conceived in that agreement is quite unique. And so this is a point I also wanted to stress. A last point I want to stress with regard to this 1990 agreement, and which is also not without relevance in the current negotiations, is that this agreement was already a pioneering agreement with regard to what I would call the integration-oriented dimension of that agreement. Integration-oriented dimension, I give you an illustration of this. In the agreement you will find a joint declaration which says the following: concerning trade in goods, if interpretation problems arrive and they come before the joint committee, the interpretation will be followed with regard to the aspect movement of goods as they are interpreted in an intra-community context. I don't know whether this is clear, but it means that the intra-community interpretation approach, we are not talking here about cases before the Court of Justice. That was not foreseen in that agreement, of course. But if we have a dispute or a problem to be settled in the joint committee structure, the joint committee will follow already the case law of the Court of Justice. So I think this was really pioneering. This was in 1990. If you make a comparative analysis with other bilateral agreements, you don't find such a reference. And I also would like to tell the audience that this was a request by Andorra, and that the EU delegation at the time was kind of astonished that this came from the Andorran side. Now, when this agreement was signed, and all the things I'm mentioning, I do this on purpose. It relates to the 1990 agreement, but it's all quite relevant in what is happening today, if I understand the situation as it is today. At the moment of the conclusion of this 1990 agreement, which was so important, there were at the time in Andorra, I remember that very well, already quite a number of concerns. Was this agreement a good thing? Was it wise for Andorra to sign such an agreement? Could it work properly? Was Andorra, as a very small state, capable? Had it the know-how, the expertise, the human resources to make this agreement work in the light of the fact that it was establishing a customs union with all the constraints that this implies? And I remember this moment of fear just after the signature, kind of existential fear. But it did not take very long. And in less than a year, I think, the atmosphere changed vis-à-vis this agreement. And it changed so much that later, this agreement became obtained almost in Andorra. Maybe my expression is too strong on this, but that's my feeling. I'm not Andorran. My feeling of my own perception of what the attitude was of Andorra and the Andorran people towards this agreement. It became almost something of an iconic nature, an iconic status. So something which is iconic, you should not touch too much. You should not change too much. So this was, I think, I wanted to mention that as a kind of introduction to my presentation. So if this agreement has been so well perceived and has been, I think that's also the position of the two parties, not just Andorra, but also the European Union, has been working quite well. Of course, there have been some interpretation problems, but on the whole, I don't think we had five discussions really during this 25 years of existence of this agreement already. So that means not very many. And they were all solved on a pragmatic and case-by-case approach. So this agreement has been working well. And if that is the message today, why then is Andorra nevertheless engaged in negotiating today an association agreement? So I think that's a kind of question which is very logical, very natural to be asked and needs to be answered. Fortunately, I think my two predecessors already gave most of the arguments, really. I don't really want to repeat that all the time. So I think that is this introduction. I wanted just to give that to you. But, ladies and gentlemen, there is a point, I think, which has not yet been mentioned very extensively so far. And that is the global context of neighborhood relations between the European Union and its neighbors, and in particular towards the internal market. And there is there, I think, a kind of general trend, which is the following. I think almost all EU's neighbors, in particular the closest ones, are obliged to live with the existence of the EU's internal market at their borders. And it is now a common feature, I think, that almost all of these neighbors, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, have been adapting themselves to the phenomenon of the EU's internal market. It is true, of course, that there may be one exception now, an important one, to this general trend, and that's the Brexit. But today, even after the elections of yesterday, nobody knows, once the Brexit is accomplished, what the position of the UK will be towards the internal market. And for the moment, we can only speculate, I think, about this. Leave the Brexit where it is for the moment. One fact of life is, and I put it rather bluntly, that the EU's neighbors are not on planet Mars. And many of the EU neighbors have made agreements with the EU on application of parts of the internal market in their legal order. No doubt, it has been mentioned already, the most advanced integration-oriented agreement was the European Economic Area with the EFTA countries. Today, remaining in the EFTA is Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And this agreement, I think, has really accomplished the impossible virtually by extending the internal market to these 3 non-EU member states. Certainly, not everything is perfect in the EEA. There are backlogs, delays in a number of areas. But on the whole, again, the EEA agreement, I think, has been functioning well or very well. And I think this also explains why the EEA, as a concept, as a model, has been so important for Andorra from the very start of its reflections on making progress towards closer relationship with the European Union. When I say that the neighbors have tried to adapt themselves to the internal market, you can ask the question, how have they done that? Of course, agreements have been signed, bilateral agreements, besides the EEA agreement, which is a multilateral agreement. But also unilateral adaptations have been taken by quite a number of neighbors. And sometimes neighbors have combined the 2 approaches. The most recent move in this direction of adaptation, if you look it into the European scale and kind of comparative analysis, is of course the association agreements with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, incorporating a deep and comprehensive free trade association. And particularly interesting is, of course, also the bilateral adaptations which have taken place in the relations with Switzerland. But there we have some problems because the Swiss bilateralism is something for which the European Union for the moment is not too happy and wants a more structured, comprehensive institutional structure. The European Union says it has reached the limits, so it's something which cannot easily be followed by the very small states. I just got a message that my time is almost over. Let me just say that the Andorran authorities who have started to reflect on this in 2008, 2009, and produced the report Cap al Mercat Interior, Faire le marché intérieur, and the governments which have followed that they have all been very much inspired by this idea to get closer to the internal market. And I think that's a very natural and a very logical choice which has been made. Now, Andorra has been able, I think, and it was mentioned by Minister Saboya, has been able in the exploratory phase, which precedes the negotiations, to explain the important elements of the Andorran vision. And it is, of course, very interesting to see that in that explanation, the agreement of 1990 was a main point of reference, of course, and also the fact that the EEA was taken as a model for the agreement to be negotiated. Now, the response, of course, by the European Union in a way was a very stimulating one because it was suggesting the conclusion of an association agreement. That was also a suggestion made by the Andorran government, by the way. Association agreements are the top of the hierarchy of bilateral agreements. The very fact that also the European Union was following this idea meant that the relations between the European Union and the very small states were taken as something very serious. Now, I'm concluding. I'm not going into the negotiations, as you can hear, as such. everything which I could have said was mentioned by Mr. Martin. But it is true that these are negotiations which are terribly complex. The contents are very complex and very often very technical. Also, the institutional aspects are difficult, but I think there is a genuine will to overcome the hurdles. And of course, last point, we are with 3 negotiating with the European Union. That means we are 4. That's not always easy, of course, because it is not because we have the very small states together that they have the same priorities and same concerns. They have a different history also. So it's not necessarily identical. And that complicates, of course, also the negotiations, but that makes them perhaps also more interesting in a way. And if you can overcome the most difficult obstacles, then I think you can be happy about the results. But of course, you never know when you negotiate. So I think at this stage, I will conclude my presentation.